Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our chief science advisor, Dr. Yu, and our seed oil survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our uh, monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters. And we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, a neighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you. Today, we have a fascinating discussion planned for you on Things Hidden. I'm your host, David Gornoski, and I'm joined by someone. This is going to be fun because we talk about anthropology on this podcast, and we do so on A Neighbor's Choice, or a radio show, which we've turned into a podcast as well. But we talk about anthropology a lot, but we don't usually have folks who are out there talking about anthropology on a podcast format day in and day out as well, and applying it to current events. But today we have that kind of guest with us, and it's a fascinating opportunity because here's a gentleman who calls himself the Illegitimate Scholar, which is always a good sign that he's not afraid to ruffle feathers and stick to the truth. He's a Marine veteran. He calls himself a cultural anthropologist burning down the ivory tower. Samuel Urban, how you doing?
I'm doing great, David. Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
Doing well. So it's good to have you on the show. And like I said, our program, we dive into anthropology, current events, and we do a big picture. So we're not going to give you every little tribal detail about that, but we love that stuff. And I want to have more of that kind of deep dive into ritual and minutia, because I think that stuff is important, just to kind of get a broader sense of where things are in the world. But we get into mimetic theory. We get into, seeing how we look at the Bible as like a roadmap to understanding the kind of anthropological dimension of human behavior as it relates to current events and looking in the past and prehistory. And I think that having someone like you, who's a fellow traveler exploring anthropology, cultural anthropology, would do us well to hear what your insights are. So I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, I am as well. And you came highly recommended from a few different people, including Typo from Biting the Bullet. Forgot to mention him.
Cool. Well, very good. So tell us a little bit about yourself. So you were a Marine. Tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into creating this program called Illegitimate Scholar.
Yeah, so I was in the Marine Corps as soon as I got out of high school. 4 years, got out and went to college. I wanted to be a social studies teacher, secondary school, high school, middle school, and I loved history and anthropology and human culture, and I love academics. I ended up taking 172 credits in the 4 years and graduating with 3 bachelor's degrees in education, history, and anthropology. It was easy because the GI Bill was paying for it. And my experience in education college was it was pretty eye-opening, and it was worse than I thought it was going to be. And I decided I didn't want to be in that system. So I got my teaching certification, I quit, and I started making this on the side.
Very cool.
Well, for full time, really, not on the side. I started doing this full time.
Wow. So what's that like to make that transition from a job that people say is kind of in high demand There's always a shortage of teachers nowadays because of how hard the school systems are. So that's a reliable check versus diving in head first full time for a media job where to tell the truth means you will be censored, shadow banned, and doxxed or whatever else people are worried about.
Yeah. I had a little bit of money saved up. I have a little bit of money saved up from just saving money. So I have that financial barrier that protects me a little bit. You know, I do have to start making money about now, but it's I had a little bit off, and I don't know. I'm so much happier anyway. I wouldn't have been happy as a teacher. I don't think I could have handled it. I wouldn't have done it. So it was that one was unacceptable. So got to pick something else.
Tell us about that. Looks like a totem pole behind you. What is that?
Oh yeah, that's a focus. That's a Asmat Warrior Shield from Papua New Guinea.
Oh, cool. Did you go there, or how did you get a hold of that?
So I used to. It's probably how I ended up here. I used to live in Indonesia when I was in 5th and 6th grade. My dad was his job went out there, and I didn't go to Papua New Guinea, but he did, and he brought that back. But I've been around the rest of Asia, not the rest of Asia, but the rest
Better
of
than
Southeast
bringing
Asia.
back a shrunken head or something, right? You were,
Yeah, seriously. Yeah. And that's real. That's, that's very real. He also had some things that they wear on the tips of their dicks, their penises. Sorry. I don't know what your language policy is here. I forgot to ask.
yeah. So so why did he go to Papua New Guinea? I mean, he was in Indonesia for work or Papua New Guinea for work?
Yeah, he was in Indonesia for work, but they would go into other places. And you know what? Actually, it wasn't Papua New Guinea. It was West Papua, which is Indonesia. Half
Okay.
the island's owned by Indonesia. So he was there
Okay.
working in the capital as a financial consultant there. He was just working for like the US government and the Canadian government at a separate time. So he would go to random places around Indonesia on work trips sometimes to help the local communities there instead.
Yeah.
It was all a lot of corruption there. I'm not sure he helped. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not. I don't know.
We have a friend from Papua New Guinea that we had to tell her story. Her name was Monica Paulus, and I saw a story about her where some missionaries had visited her, and she was being accused of being a witch, and they were burning women alive, because of someone. If you yawn the wrong way, and there's a death in the tribe in some of those areas, the death of a child or something, or a sickness, that they can, if you're yawning, they think a spirit's that you're covering up, that a spirit's leaving your body or something, and they can burn you alive. And she was a woman who fought back. They tried to kill her multiple times, but she started creating a shelter for women who were being accused of witch sorcery. And I had her on one time. She called in. She couldn't get into the radio station studio line, but she called in through like Facebook or something, and I had to put my phone up to the radio microphone to let her talk to me. And she's talking about people were trying to bang in the door and bring the door down while we're on live radio. And we'll go to commercial break after this, folks. How are you going to do that? I mean, it's just,
oh my gosh.
What do you do there?
Yeah.
But eventually she got out of Dodge. I said, you got to get out of there, man. I mean, stop trying to save the witches and get out of there. You're going to be cooked. And so she did. She went over to, I think Australia or New Zealand, I think, and she's doing fine, it seems like now. But that's an example of what we need. I know what we're doing right now at the border, mass, invasion of millions of people, sponsored by billionaires and stuff. But that's fake. But there is some place for, if people are burning you alive, to be able to have a place of refuge in the world, I think, so.
Yeah.
Example of that.
Yeah, to put that in a little bit of context with, I don't know how much she touched on this, but my view is that those, because this is a thing that doesn't just happen in Papua New Guinea. Unfortunately, it also, Stone Age Herbalist has written a little bit about this. I'm forgetting the specific country, but I think somewhere in West Africa, it happens in multiple places. A lot of times it's tied to, like, yes, they might say you're yawning, but everyone's going to yawn sometimes. It's one of those things where it feels to me like it's more of a method of social control.
Right.
So like the powers that be in whatever that is, and they could be tribal elders. It depends on how their society is organized. And Papua New Guinea is the most diverse linguistically and ethnically place of its size in the entire world. It's truly incredible.
Right.
The difference of like some of them very benevolent, some of them malevolent, others, societies at that small level tend to contradict each other when they're near each other. So they'll define themselves based on what they aren't by what someone else is and how they're different. But a lot of those witches, it seems to me that it has to do with cutting like essentially waste as they would see it from their society, because a lot of times when witches are hunted, they're because they are single women, widows, often older, and I think that they're perceived to not be providing as much for the society, and excuses are made up to get rid of them. I could be wrong, but that is my theory.
Interesting. She said it was related to jealousy. They have a word there in her area called jealous, which is like an extreme form of jealousy. Jelas is how they spelled it. And basically, she said that there was like some property that she was set in line to inherit, and there was jealousy about her receiving it. And I asked her if Christianity's impact in the area had abated the sacrificial impulse, and she seemed to say it didn't do much. In fact, some people who would go to church would still practice the old religions practices and superstitions as well. And it made me believe that the jealous concept, she said, was actually inflamed because of people having disparities and accumulations of Western tokens of wealth. And that disparity of like, who's the person with this nice stuff and all that, it can create more extreme forms of envy that it turn into a snowballing of witch sorcery as a accusation,
So this wealth disparity thing is something that is seen in a lot of different places. Generally, a lot of these earlier societies don't have a concept of material wealth as what is important, because most of them, if you're living as a hunter-gatherer, material wealth means very little because you're traveling. If you're acculturated in a culture that is settled, then material wealth has more of a value. Or maybe you're a herder where material wealth is in cows. But there is a long there's so many examples of material culture, of material wealth being introduced, and the concept of accumulating it into societies. I think most notably would be it's over there. There's a book by an actual leftist economist, forgetting the name right now, but it talks about how these were introduced into Native American cultures, the new materials, and the result was that it was a shakeup in the society. So let me use my words a little bit better here. So this is something that I don't know how friendly you are to him, but the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, talked about is technology being related to a change in culture, because technology and material culture inevitably changes the way that you interact with the world, because the different objects that you have, you interact with the world differently. And relativity as well is incredibly important for humans. In absolute terms, poverty means very little. For the majority of human history, 99% of humans were in absolute poverty. What matters is relativity. And relativity in practical terms means that the relative wealth of people only matters if it's relative. It doesn't matter when it's absolute, because people's perceptions of the world are based on their own perception of it. And yeah, I think I got out what I was trying to there. I tend to talk very jumping around like this, but I feel like based on your background, you're okay with that, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, in keeping with like mimetic theory, your objects that you desire are in relationship to who is the one having those objects or attaining those objects, whether it's a social status or a relationship partner or a car or a t-shirt or a cell phone or a piece of gold. It's mediated by the person who's desiring that object. And it's actually, Rene Girard says that, mimetic desire is actually a desire for being. It's at its heart, it's a metaphysical kind of this is more getting into the philosophy part of it, but it's a desire to have one's neighbor's being, to possess the otherness, the exotic otherness of the neighbor, and the object that they have, or the position, the job, the title, the whatever, is a token that represents that otherness. That if they, and you see it with the children, the classic example people use about mimetic theory is like two toddlers in a playroom and there's a pile of toys. Maybe there's two Mickey Mouse dolls and one toddler picks up one and automatically the other one wants it, right? And so they grab it. And then the first toddler didn't really care about the toy at first, but now that the neighbor is pulling for it, he learns from the neighbor its desirable quality, and he starts to pull back harder. Like, no, actually, that's mine. I want that. And they just go on a tug of war, right? And I always add the kind of proto scapegoat third object there is that, they can go and pull on that forever until maybe a little puppy dog comes along and they're now united in fascination at pulling the puppy dog's tail in torment, because he's, or whatever. So that's like a proto scapegoating effect where, when you have an intractable mimetic rivalry taking over a community where it becomes all against all, you can resolve that tension. This is kind of where I was going with Monica Paulus's illustration. You can resolve that tension by kind of like uniting around one of the uniting against, and this can happen in different ways, where you can unite against a kind of arbitrary scapegoat that just stands out in a sea of sameness. They're like you said, maybe they have a disparate amount of wealth. The relative wealth that they possess is just way out of proportion for everybody else around, in terms of they have like 50 pigs and everybody else has one or something. I'm using extreme examples. Maybe they're hunchback, maybe they're deformed, maybe they got a club foot like Oedipus, maybe they've got a really heinous face like Medusa. I mean, they got one eye like Cyclops. Maybe they've got, whatever it is, it becomes something that is an arbitrary marker of differentiation, which is irresistible to a crowd lost in a sea of sameness. And that sea of sameness converges on in a kind of almost like a physics motion. It kind of charges that energy up and dispels it onto a common vessel. And that's what we call a scapegoat, right? The spontaneous event happens unconsciously, not intentionally. It's not like it's a conspiracy. Hey, let's kill this guy, he's not going to fight back. It's more of a feeling. It's more of a feeling that this person stands out and they're the ones that caused all the bad blood. And Girard talks about how plagues and famines, like the concept of a plague is in ancient literature oftentimes interchangeable with a social plague. Like where's the actual bug here versus the plague of bad behavior? So I think all of these things kind of are foundational to understanding the common pattern of what we see scapegoat lynchings, which then get codified later on into ritual sacrifice. Now, I know that, and that's why I wanted to have you on, because I know that you're coming from anthropology, reading other different folks, and I wanted to have that kind of insight that you could share from your vantage point, having not kind of honed in on the mimetic theory approach. So you just dive in wherever you see.
So one thing that I wanted to show you, since we were talking about Papua New Guinea, I hope I have this book right here, but I probably don't. That's okay. So there's a book specifically about Papua New Guinea. This is something you said a little while ago, by an anthropologist, ethnographer named Donald Tuzin, who went to a tribe in Papua New Guinea over like 25 years. This tribe was run by a patriarchal cult, and over time of the introduction of material goods, Western material goods, in line with Western ideology in the form of Methodist missionaries who were teaching essentially like modern feminism to these women who were in a very literal patriarchal cult, not like the US in the 21st century's patriarchy. Like the whole cult, their whole deal was that they killed women every once in a while to keep them in line. So it's like for real. And eventually it does end up destroying the cult in the sense that the cult had power before. And I'm sure some people had figured out that the cult was just esoteric knowledge passed up and up. And as the men moved up in status, eventually they find out that, oh no, it wasn't spirits. We are the spirits, and we are killing everybody. Obviously it's a short version. So it's very interesting. And so while I do think that Christianity doesn't stop these practices, it certainly seems like it has lowered them quite a bit. But
sure,
it cannot stomp them out at all, because they're there. They're there underlying, and there's always going to be someone who, based on the shakeup of the society, and I say shakeup, it's not that good of a word, because it's more of a earthquake of a shakeup in the society. It's a slingshot effect almost. It's you're not living in balance. And that brings me to the next thing I wanted to talk about. And that is the incentives of a culture and what they lead to, because it's a trope of cultures like Native Americans. And I'm going to use Native American cultures as an example for this, but I could point to other examples on every single other continent besides Antarctica of human cultures that think exactly like this. But I'm using Native Americans because that's our culture. That's what we're familiar with. So it is very true that, you go down to Mexico, they're living in a state-based society, huge infrastructure, bureaucracy, complicated religion. You go to the Northeast and you find Algonquin Native Americans. The Iroquois are much more advanced, frankly. The Algonquins who live in New England, I've done a little bit of archaeology on some Algonquin sites. They are not entirely hunter-gatherers, but they're hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists. And I often find that when you look at these, at people who, because of they don't have a need for a complex bureaucracy that serves 1.5 million people, there is truly non-arbitrarily less complexity to their governing system. So they're a little bit easier to understand. And they tell us a lot about ourselves, because we have been modern humans. Last year, they discovered 300,000 years. So, as long as you believe in that, then yes, these were modern humans with the same brains as us, and they acted this way. So we have to understand why. And this is true of, it is a trope. You'd hear this for liberals, but it is true. I promise you that very simple peoples, very, very primitive peoples, which is a word they don't really like to use anymore, but I think it does the job. Very primitive peoples, absolutely, their cultures were built in most cases around keeping in a balance with nature. Like they truly were. That's not fake. It's not just some like movie thing that was made up in 20th century noble savage. That's real. And there are multiple stories, including of Huron from Canada who was talking to a French guy. I have it in my notes for the specifics. If you care, I'll send it to you later. But of talking about how he understood, and a lot of these Native Americans as well, and other people of the same era, they would be great orators because it was necessary for their culture. That's how they convinced people, because they're being run by big men. I'm sorry, I'm throwing a lot of different stuff at you, but they were organized by big men who are leaders that lead simply by like consensus. Essentially, it's in the most basic societies. There isn't even a spoken constitution. There isn't one. It's just, and that makes leadership very contextual, especially when you don't have permanent roots. So these big men could shift over time. And when there was a context for one thing, they'd pick a different leader, they'd serve someone else, it would go back and forth and things like that. But there was always cultural beliefs and stories like you're talking about, these ideas that were passed down that guided the ways that people thought. So it guides the way that they evaluate information. And there would always be these stories that prevented anybody within the culture, because they would be stopped by consensus. Other people would see what they were doing based on how they evaluate events, based on the stories that they pass down. And they would pass down stories to make sure that no one, like, I know you've all know Harari is a globalist and everything, but it is a pretty good book to read as one of the books that you read about ancient human history. And he would, they knew that settling down was awful for them. They knew that it would screw all of the balance of nature up. They knew that, and they prevented it from happening multiple times. And we have examples of it. And so their incentives in their society were created in a way that pushed everybody to live in balance and to have a ritual. These were very common, where you thank an animal. the practical effect of having a ritual where you thank an animal is creating the value in a society that we value the lives of animals. We respect their souls. We believe they have souls. That guides us to treat them with respect. That guides us to not, mow them down with machine guns and sell their pelts to France. But when those ideas are destroyed, you then have a thing like England and you have a thing like France. And I'm sorry, I know I've been talking, but I have one last closing thought on that, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
China. So China is in the Asian languages around China, and a lot of the minorities, there's 55 minorities, recognized minorities that live in China. And in a lot of these languages, China is known as the Middle Kingdom. They're known as the center of the earth. And in a lot of ways, China is the most advanced culture in the entire world. In the 1600s, the Chinese, or 1500s, one of them, the Chinese had a treasure fleet, just the most magnificent fleet the world had ever seen, largest one ever. Thousands of ships, massive cities on these things. And they just loaded it up full of treasure and everything. And they just did a tour around basically the known world. And then they got back, and there were all these, and then, there was some turmoil. There were all these naval wars, and they just burned the entire fleet in like the 1600s. And there's never been anything that matches it. And that's because China, and you can get this by reading, documents from the 19th century of talks between especially British, but other ones as well, and the Chinese ambassadors. They didn't want any new technology to come in. They didn't want any new goods to come in. They told the British, we don't need anything that you have. But what happens is that the Chinese incentives were set up to have harmony, which is in line with the Tao, one of the major Chinese religions. In harmony, they wanted to live and just continue to do what they're doing, like over and over, because they understood the cycles of life, and they understood that they needed to, not do something like this, like, usury capitalism, but to do something like this that has small waves. And this was built into the incentives of Chinese culture. But what happens is that was all well and good until the British showed up, and they change, and it knocks the entire system out of harmony. And it comes to one of these new, there have been 15 or so of them in Chinese history, where everything splits up. The summer and autumn, or the summer and winter period, the warring states, the three kingdoms, all of these different ones. There's a bunch of them, but they always come back together because those incentives are built into their society. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. I want to take kind of a moment to get you to explain your approach to how your study of anthropology helps inform your understanding of current events.
Right. Let me just write that down.
Trying to understand kind of, because I kind of have an approach with understanding, again, the kind of apocalyptic nature of Christianity, which you've alluded to a little bit in some of the things you've described, unraveling the equilibrium of old societies and kind of shaking things up. There's a Flannery O'Connor has a story where she's got a character in there that says Jesus done shook everything, or Jesus done. There's a Southern character that says something like Jesus done changed everything or shook everything up, and this is this idea of like this kind of unsettling event that takes place when these cultures encounter Western societies that kind of impose their worldview, or technology and things like that just kind of blow out the whole machinery of their societies. It doesn't mean it has to happen that way, but it tends to happen that way. And so I use that to kind of explain why everything seems to be unraveling in light of where we're at today in the 21st century. Why is it that everything looks more and more what I call Christ-haunted victimism, where the concern for victims becomes the highest way of gaining social status? And I think that's an impact of Christianity, in which the highest social ordering imagery is that of an outcast. God stands in solidarity with the one who is tortured, naked, left alone, and outcasted from society, and that victim becomes the triumphant symbol of victory in history because of Christianity. And that story's aesthetics and ethics haunt and shape the contours of the Western imagination in all of its errors. So everything we see, like victimism and wokeism, is just hyper Christianity trying to mimetically outcompete Christianity in its concern for victims. And it has this kind of revolutionary fervor that wants to, in an ironic way, bring back the sacrificial machinery of the scapegoat mechanism, but this time in the name of revenge for the victims, right? So I call leftism revenge of the nerds Christianity, and the right is more like warmed over microwave Nietzschean. I mean, the real right wing is kind of still in that vein, in my opinion, trying to Coca-Cola classic scapegoat mechanism, trying to return. Why can't the beautiful people and the strong people rule like their natural right is? That kind of idea is still inherent to a lot of right-wing sensibilities. The police should be trusted first and then questioned later. Those are right-wing kind of impulses that come from a desire to return to sacrificially enclosed hierarchies that have lasted for thousands of years, right? And Christianity comes along some of those iterations of that classical sacrificially enclosed hierarchy, and people who are conservative Christians tend to long for the paganistic elements of their society more than the actual kind of unsettling effects of the Christian part of it, right? And so I think the left has been more effective at dominating our culture because it more effectively imitates the aesthetic of Christianity in its concern for victims, its concern for the least of these. It taps into that imagination and that kind of that kind of moral imagination that people have about always in the hunt for the newest outcast, right? And there's an insatiable hunt for more and more outcasts that need to be vindicated and turned into the new kind of like martyrs of society that are venerated with sacrificial revenge. So it doesn't have the mercy, it doesn't have the forgiveness of Christianity, it doesn't have the universal guilt of the fall of Christianity. It doesn't have forgiveness, it doesn't have grace, but it has the aesthetic of the vindication of the slain lamb, right? This idea of like the martyr's perch that Christ sits on. And everybody covets the martyr's perch, but they don't want to carry the burden of the martyr's perch of the cross on their shoulder, but they all want to get their picture with it. It's like those, you ever seen those carnival cutouts where you have the cutout of the fireman and you get to put your face in it? It's like there's a cross and there's a little cutout. You can put your face in it, get your picture taken. That's modernism. That's the West in a nutshell. And so that's my kind of like framing of, in a big scope of what anthropology can help us understand about current events. But I'm interested to hear your angle. I mean, as someone who's not looking at mimetic theory as much, but looking at other voices and scholars in anthropology, what are some of the things that you found that anthropology can help us, learn about current events?
So there's a number of words that kind of have become dirty words in right-wing spaces that I basically defend all the time. And those are cultural relativity and social construct. Mm-hmm. And those are two concepts that I use all the time. And what I say about cultural relativity is that cultural relativity is very good as an academic tool to talk about cultures that may be practicing things that we consider demonic, which I do consider many of the things I study as demonic. But from a perspective of studying it for academic pursuits, we have a cultural relative sense of just trying to break it down to the most basic to understand as objectively as possible what is happening. And that is different from moral relativism, where I'm taking a moral judgment out of it. But what has often happened is that cultural relativism as a academic tool and moral relativism as a judgment, the differences have been muddled both in colloquial use and in academic use, and that's probably the biggest problem with mainstream academia. And to be fair, in the past, they were too far in the other direction. Like there would be guys going to Cambodia and being like, well, these idiots couldn't have made this. So Trajan, Roman Emperor Trajan did it. That's a real thing that happened. There was a correction that needed to be done to make them most objective, but that's my goal. So social constructions, and this gets into how I use it to view current events. I spend a lot of time breaking down things to their most basic, using true cultural relativism in the sense that I am just understanding what is being done and understand why it's being done without trying to rationalize it. And that's with the understanding that human beings have been modern humans for 300,000 years, and that we are a mix of our nature and our nurture. Our nurture being the social constructs that are, all around us in the energy that I would believe in, which I believe in energy. It seems like you do as well. And this is something that basically all human societies, which most of them can be classified in anthropology in the broad spectrum of something called animism. So most primitive human societies, most early technology human societies, they believe in something called animism, and there are elements of it in basically any sort of religion, including like Santeria is one thing, and animism is often tied in with shamanism, which not mutually exclusive. There, people practice shamanism even in some Christian sects, even in Islam, and they practice it everywhere. But I mean, I've gone into episodes on shamanism, on religion, on and actually that brings me to the next thing, which is cultural diffusion. And cultural diffusion being how cultures spread into each other. So whenever two cultures meet, they always each affect each other. They really do. And sometimes it's not obvious. Sometimes it's not in the name. They might not say what the name is, but like just because it's not called something doesn't mean that there wasn't an effect of the other culture. So like, yes, leftism, as you're alluding to, being an element of like an extension of certain elements of Christianity. I agree with you. I believe that. And this would be the idea of the metaphysical ideas, all of the, I'm losing myself here, sorry. The social ideas that guide how we evaluate information. These are those stories. They're going to guide how we evaluate information. So through this Christian lens that's imported, certain elements only are imported that is familiar to them, but even though they don't recognize it as Christianity, doesn't mean that that isn't in the back end, because it's always in the background. I mean, the Roman Empire is in the background of everything, and in some senses literal, like, the size of a road based on the Roman roads, and then the railroads being based on the Roman roads and whatever. So when I think about judging events of today on cultural through the lens of anthropology, I just try to break them down into the most basic. So the most basic elements I can, like when I talk about a country, like the borders of a country are permeable. Like I'm from New England. Culturally, I feel a lot closer to a Canadian from Nova Scotia than I do to an American from Washington State. Those people are terrible, at least the ones in the city. But or California, these are concepts that are socially constructed ideas. They're created by human beings. They're not created by God. So don't talk about them like they're innate, because they're not. A country, yes, I'm an American, but I'm many other things. The idea that I should even concentrate on what my nationality is as most important is nonsense, because obviously people have different levels of loyalty to different types of identities. Some people racial, and these are all different types of social constructions. And yes, there is a genetic element to race, but the construction of how we think about race is socially constructed in the sense that we decide in America, we have Black, Native American, Hispanic as an ethnicity, even though it's not, and Asian. We break it up one way, they break it up differently. If you told a guy in China that he was or Korea that they were the same race as a Japanese person, they might fight you for real. But that's how we do it in America. So specifically, how I would compare something is you look at something like a classification like terrorist, right? And think about what it is that really makes somebody a terrorist. Because when I look at that and I look at what the man-made classification of what a terrorist is, I end up looking at situations and looking at the spectrum of what is a terrorist and what becomes a government and finding along that path in the modern world, as well as in ancient examples, things that I can compare. Like, I know that Nelson Mandela was a terrorist, and that's not disputed, but nobody talks about it like that. You get what I'm saying right now?
Yeah, tell us how he was a terrorist, just to give that example.
Right. So Nelson Mandela was part of an organization that was classified he was part of a social construction. He was an official member of an organization that was listed by like the CIA, Interpol, international organizations as a terrorist group. That terrorist group eventually becomes part of the official government in South Africa. And this is something that happens. Like this is what happens. I mean, our own country was started by what would be called a terrorist group, an insurgency, a rebellion, any of these things. So when we talk about things like, I like to break down terms like terrorist, like break down these terms that people don't want to think about, because what they want to do is they want to say that's a terrorist group. They're terrorists. So that means that they're not okay. And this is a legitimate government over here, and their actions are good because they're legitimate. And what that allows, and what using that term allows, it allows for governments and other NGOs and people who control capital and power to decide what organizations get legitimacy, what organizations in the minds of many of their people, because this is the way that we evaluate information based on our own social upbringing or our acculturation, who is legitimate in using force and who is not, because some of
who
the
is it's based on proximity to political power and wealth.
Right. Most
like
of the time, yeah.
Like the Summer of Love protesters, you never heard a single evil thing said about them by the giant multinational corporations that run media. You don't hear anything negative. You hear it on kitschy little garbage right-wing streaming shows with eagles in the background. Those
Right.
are the only ones that say anything negative about that. And the same thing goes for like the J6 guys. Those are considered officially designated, TV designated insurrectionists, brought to you by, Pfizer and all the other corporate, it's like there's a consensus clique of corporations and government agencies, and they have a generally shared worldview, and its distinction from what is not allowed. And that has a lot to do with identity and looks and, value sets and so forth. And those are people that are officially designated as insurrectionists, and the other one is considered heroes, that were allowed to get out of a quarantine free card because of the nobility of their cause,
Yes,
so.
100%. And to me, that really at its most basic, I love, bringing things down to their most basic. Are you familiar with Bog Beef at all? Good old boys, Marbleck.
Mm-mm.
They do a political show. Really great one. Bog Beef's main thing that he hammers in is patronage theory. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Okay, well, you're going to love this, and I hope you'll look at some of Bog Beef's stuff on it.
Yeah.
But patronage theory is essentially, and he would do this better than I will, but it's very similar. Feudalism is probably the best example of it. It's the most literal example of it. But patronage is the idea that a political system, like, and actually a better example is what I was just talking about before, a terrorist group becoming a government of a country. When a terrorist group becomes a government of a country, when Stalin took over in Russia, all of the top officials are his buddies who fought in the terrorist group that became the new government. Right. This is a patronage system. You're a general. You have a bunch of officers in a Roman legion. Yeah. Their success is tied in. Your incentives are tied in with each other. So what you have in the United States is a patronage system that keeps certain people as an out-group and certain people as an in-group. So when you have the Democrats who are getting votes from certain segments of the population, they're going to help. They're going to use their funding, including funding from people like SBF, and then and then no one gets prosecuted except for their patsy, poor autistic dude, SBF. I actually feel bad for him because it's not like he was one of many, but I digress. you're going to give money and you're going to give goods and resources to not only on an individual scale, but also on like a city scale. Federal funding will go to places like if a certain group is in charge of the federal government, like the Democrats, the Republicans, they're going to give out their resources to people that are in line with them in their patronage systems, because people understand intuitively that when they're a part of one of those patronage systems, it helps them to help the group. And so they not only are they benefited by helping the group, but they are also benefited by the way that they evaluate information. And because generally what ends up happening is that the in-group that they are believes certain things. And, there's many things that humans can rationalize. They can rationalize basically anything. So being within that patronage group, if there is a belief that they hold, which in any universe, or at least they can surround themselves with people that agree with their ideas, and they're allowed to believe something that maybe to someone else would be obviously not true, if that is going to help them in their career, a lot of times people will just implicitly, not even on purpose, just be like, yep, I believe that, just move along.
Yeah.
Don't look at the nets outside the places that produce our mass-produced products. Don't look at the cobalt mines. We don't need to worry about that. We need to worry about Decepticons in the United States getting surgeries. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people's beliefs are not really something they believe. They just unconsciously go with the winning ticket, which one has more social status, which goes back to what you're talking about, relative wealth. And, it's your social status is in relationship to what you're not, and who you're not associated with, and that kind of thing,
Right. And in those, I love that you brought that up, because in those early societies, when we're talking about like horticulturalists, one of the ways that they really, the incentive structure of their society, the way that they told their stories and what it produced in the society, it produced not only, a equilibrium with nature in a very real way, but how it does that is by producing incentives that provide that put people that need to be in the leadership roles to continue that equilibrium in there. So what was I going to say? So I think I already said that, but so the way that they do that is that, like, when you were talking about objects before, the object is the right thing. The object becomes the right thing through the use of the metaphor and the way that it makes them evaluate information. And I'm repeating myself, but that's good to hammer down a specific point. So they look for that object, and that can even be a visual representation, which would be a literal object, but that object has some sort of ceremonial power, which gives them prestige. And often those wouldn't be hereditary. Almost never are these early societies with band level people, band to tribal level people. We're talking about at most 1,000. They're not going to have hereditary. There's obviously a few examples, you can find them, but almost never are they going to be hereditary, because then everybody's evaluated as they go and contextually. But the introduction of new diseases, which destroys the entire population, destroys the social structure, even without all the new technology and the introduction of other people. I mean, the deaths themselves, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the deaths from diseases were 90+% of the deaths, like tens of millions of people died without ever seeing a European person, because 100 years after there wasn't a lot of colonization the first 100 years because technology wasn't there yet. And also they couldn't really get there until a lot of the natives died. So what that does is that all of these American, and I say American in the sense of the entire continent, both continents, all of these civilizations, including the large ones like the Aztecs, are in complete disarray. They're in, you can deal with on an equilibrium level people dying and the population being at replacement level year after year, generation after generation. That's what a society that's trying to live in harmony is doing. They're trying to get to a stable level. But I don't know how long it would take for a society where 80% over several generations consecutively, 80% of the population keeps dying. There are ceremonial roles that need to be filled, that can be filled without a catastrophic event. But when you have such a disjointed level of death in such a mass area, it essentially wipes. It's like a hard reset on the culture, and that's entirely no stability. And when you have no stability, it's anyone's game. And when it's anyone's game, it's violence. It's violence because people are if they don't feel safe, if they don't feel stable, and the reality of their environment is that they're not, then there's a wild power struggle, and we've seen that.
Sounds like the Great Reset.
Yeah,
with it's been to the T there, the plague and everything, and now they're going to reorganize society for the new normal, and it's a power shift taking place, coinciding with the color revolution. I mean, you get like the 1619 project is like a new. It looks like like you've had let's say you have a giant corporation and there's the old guard that likes the logo the way it is and they like the product lineup the way it is, and then you get a new guard coming in and they're like, no, actually we're going to reshape this and we're going to give it a new logo and it's going to have a new product lineup because we got to upgrade this whole corporation's agenda and philosophy. That's what's happening when you have like things like 1619. It's a revolutionary declaration of war against the original revolutionary, moment of the founding, 1776. It's the natural, in my opinion, the natural end result of a nation that's in love with revolution. Revolution ends like this. It ends with the old revolutionaries are a little bit outdated to the newest avant-garde of revolutionary violence. So it's like, yeah. I mean, 1776 was pretty edgy in 1776. But now in 2020 America, 1619 sounds even edgier because we're going to roll the founding moment of that original revolutionary project. We're going to roll that time back to expose the underbelly, right? And then that opens up a whole new opportunity to say, okay, so now that we've exposed your fantasy land as a nightmare, now we get to, with the chaos that unfolds with meaning in that moment, we get to use the wet concrete to shape the new society the way we want it.
Right. And it's they use these old institutions that have been altered in ways over time to create something that is completely different from what it was before, but obviously still has certain roots.
Yeah.
In like the, I don't remember who I was talking about this. No, it was Stone Age Herbalist. Stone Age Herbalist, great guy, interview on my channel, Illegitimate Scholar. But he was talking about how the university system, I mean, even in the United States, because ours is rooted in the British system, was rooted in at the time, the Catholic religion in the UK. And that is in the background. And they will use those same methods, and they'll use the legitimacy of institutions like Harvard and Yale, and in England, Oxford and Cambridge, to certify the new knowledge. And to people who believe in these institutions and trust these institutions, most people are not going to look into the details of it. They're just going to trust the institution. So they borrow from these institutions as they change to be different things over time. They borrow from their legitimacy and they get their ideas essentially certified in the minds of many people who simply see the words Harvard and they believe that it's good. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I wanted to go back to something you said. You said that some rituals and behaviors you describe that you think still need to be studied, but you still think they're demonic. What's some examples of demonic rituals? Or maybe you weren't talking about rituals, but if that's what I thought I heard you say, what are some demonic rituals that you could give us illustration of that would help?
Well, I mean, cannibalism is the easy one to talk about. And it's also very common. It's so people
How common is it today?
Today, not very at all.
How many countries, let me ask you this. How many countries, roughly speaking, do you think allow for like societally sanctioned cannibalism in some form or another today? I'm saying.
So it would definitely be something that would be implicitly allowed from a cultural sense rather than explicitly allowed, mostly because a lot of the countries, you could say, a lot of the structures of countries in a place like Africa, we'll say. Papua New Guinea is a better example, but they're a little bit weirder. But even in Papua New Guinea, I mean, the structure of the countries is based on the liberal Western model, basically, in all cases. That's the underlying structure. A lot of them, if these are countries and they're outside of a European diaspora country like the US, Canada, Australia, then it's a structure that's been imposed on other people. So that structure in some place like the Congo is going to be imposed on a certain level of the population. It often doesn't have the same reach as a different kind of a more indigenous social structure. It's going to be something that they're not going to have ambulances everywhere. It's going to be smaller. It's going to be kind of an imitation of a country like the US, that's a large bureaucratic Anglo diaspora country. But so those countries, and when I say those countries, it means those governments and those people who are themselves the closest to the colonial legacy. They might be indigenous themselves in that nation, but they are going to be closest to it. They might be part European blood. They might be all European blood in certain cases. Even if they're not European blood, they likely are from an elite family, because elite families would be attached to the colonial governments, because attaching yourselves to the colonial governments, a patronage system would make you wealthy. That's how it works. That's how patronage works, and that's how governments work. So these people are going to be more detached than a lot of others who maybe live in places that through practical means those governments can't reach. And a lot of these places, they don't have road networks. A lot of people are living in various states of primitiveness. So there isn't like a hard line where you have some guy who's watching NFL on a TV and wearing Western clothes and somebody who's wearing a grass skirt and cutting someone's head off. You have a spectrum where in some place like Papua New Guinea, they have certain people living in essentially an uncontacted state, but not really. That doesn't really exist because of the concept of cultural diffusion. They'll be talking to someone else, another group of people that they did talk, or maybe you go down 7 steps, but even now, like even North Sentinel Island, which they call uncontacted, they've been contacted before. So it's not that they're uncontacted, but they have the least amount of contact.
That's the one where they throw spears at you when you take photos of them. Yeah.
That's the one, because they've made the choice not to be contacted. Yeah. And the reason is essentially India was giving them a bunch of food. They were giving them a bunch of resources. Yeah. And it probably brought disease to North Sentinel Island, and it definitely caused a societal shakeup because they were introducing material goods. And then the Indian government stopped bringing them stuff. And what happens when that happens is that they had begun to rely on those gifts. So they were reliant on the Indian government, and then they left. There was probably disease from the foreign people who they don't have antibodies against coming in. And then they stopped bringing them stuff. So they're like, these guys came in and screwed up our whole deal. We were fine before they got here. That's another.
I bet India wants to send them Owen Benjamin next.
I love that guy. Yeah, no, I'm sure. It's funny as hell.
Hey, we're gonna pay all expenses tour to do a stand-up comedy tour at this island. Here you go.
I wonder if you take it. How much would I have to pay him? I will. I'm saying it right now. Name your price, Owen. Yeah, so there's a spectrum of people, right? Because like if you go to Papua New Guinea, there's a city, and some of the people working in that city grew up in a village wearing grass skirts in the jungle. But you'll go in and there's people living in pretty primitive ways, living in primitive homes, and they're wearing Western clothes. So there's going to be a spectrum, but certain of these indigenous traditions are going to be tolerated because in the people around them are the way that they evaluate information. They understand the power that still exists for certain of these cults and traditions, and that still holds weight with them. And until it stops holding weight with them based on the changing over generations, usually, I mean, it has to be for real change to be over generations, they'll start to evaluate the information differently, and that's when the practices can really end. But they are existing. They happen even in like Puerto Rico. There's certain cultures that would practice it entirely, and there's certain other places where there's a specific esoteric cult that practices it. But the practices of things like cannibalism, and there are different types of reasons that people do cannibalism, different ways. The Agori they're a Hindu sect in India. Hindu religion is pretty poorly understood by Western academia. It's not really capable of understanding it well. Hinduism is very broad. So there are certain people, they are cannibals, but apparently they just rob cadavers, which is one way that people do it. In other other places of cannibalism, it can be a form of punishment, essentially. So it's a ritual where somebody who's done them wrong, it's a spiritual punishment for them to be eaten. And that's tied in with practices, and it's something that people try to avoid in those societies. But if I were to guess, I mean, there's dozens of countries on 3 continents where these practices are happening. I don't know of any specifics, but I would be surprised if there wasn't. Well, they're definitely happening in South America, because this is definitely happening in Brazil. It's definitely happening in Asia, because it's definitely happening on New Guinea and maybe other places, but probably just New Guinea. It's definitely happening in India, and it's definitely happening.
Stone Age. I read an article. I don't know too much about Stone Age herbalists, but I read an article of his about the different types of cannibalism in China. And man, I didn't know there were so many different nuances to that topic there, you know?
Yeah.
So it certainly made me lose my appetite for the Chinese restaurant down the road just after reading so many different ways to do cannibalism in Chinese cuisine. I said, dear God.
Right.
But,
so I haven't read that particular article, but I would bet that most of those were Chinese ethnic minorities. So they weren't Han Chinese. There probably are some Han Chinese that practice that.
They did. He had all kinds of ones. There was ones about like, oh my gosh, you eat your child or something. I don't, dear God, I don't know.
I think that's something that you get when you like the Abrahamic religions are the only religions that are mutually exclusive. And so, and in practice, they aren't really that mutually exclusive, because you still have indigenous traditions. You have things like Irish Catholicism is, which is my background, is that they took all the old gods and ceremonies as saints. And similar things happened in Latin America with indigenous people adopting Christianity. They still keep their indigenous traditions within their particular blend of Christianity. You even have a situation like Iran, where basically Iran becomes Shia Islam, and for whatever reason that works out better with Zoroastrianism, which was the religion they had before that. And then the Arabs and other peoples become Sunni Islam, and likely has to do with their own culture and how they evaluated information. And that, of course, comes with unity for the Shia Muslims in the face of Islam kind of overpowering in an esoteric and a practical sense. Yeah. The Muslim, the Sunni, or I'm sorry, the Zoroastrianism. So they just were like, okay, we gotta join, but we're not gonna join Sunni Islam. We'll join Islam, but we're gonna do our own thing. And that's not. I mean, I'm simplifying it, of course. So I apologize, Muslims, if I'm butchering your story, but that's me trying to break it down to the most basic.
I mean, look at this stuff. I'm just going to show you some of these. This is in his stoneageherbalist.com. Look at these Chinese types. There's so many different types. For example, and he has Chinese medicine in the 1919 short story Medicine, written by Chinese author Lu Xun. An old man and his wife go out to purchase a folk remedy to help cure their son from tuberculosis. They invest their savings in this medicine, but it fails to work and their little boy dies. The remedy is in question turns out to be a warm bread roll soaked in the blood of an executed revolutionary. After the sick boy dies and is buried, the mothers of them both, revolutionary and citizen, meet at the graveside, and Zun draws our attention to the metaphor of the old literally feeding off the blood of the young and the dynamic. It goes on to talk about they have I mean, some of this stuff's pretty disgusting, but oldest written text in China, the oldest written medical text in China is the Wuxi Bingfang, recipes for 52 ailments dating back to 168 BC in the Han Dynasty. And among magical incantations and snakebite cures is the mention of several human body parts, hair, fingernails, and menstrual cloth to be used as remedies. In 1597, Li Shizin published the Bingkao Gangmu, his most important work and the best preserved source of Chinese medicine. In it, Shizin details the extensive and meticulous use of human body parts for a wide range of conditions. These can be as crude as a basic whole human head, or as particular as the white sediment from a child's urine, the first feces of a newborn baby, placental fluid, the earth from underneath a hanged man, ground gallstones, human tears and saliva. I mean, dear God, it's just, and then it's like, I mean, I don't even go read some of this stuff. It's just too repulsive. Um,
It's hard to imagine that those types of practices might have served some sort of purpose for a society, but just the fact that they existed meant that somewhere in there, there's something that allowed them to continue going, something to do with how like the incentive to maybe hunt someone. What?
Some of it was a placebo effect, probably, right? Or
Well,
catharsis.
so I don't mean actually. Well, there might be some truth, some metaphysical truth to eating something like that. I don't know, but really, what I'm talking about is more of the idea of living in a society that has an aversion to being eaten because of their superstitions. These are ways of social control and ways of society promoting certain practices and discouraging others. These stories and what people believe to be true to them, which can in itself produce physiological results. I mean, witchcraft, anecdotal everywhere, has been found to actually kill people. I mean, it does happen. How you think that's happening is up to you as you interpret it, but it's happened. So there's something going on there. And there is, when you have a society that has an aversion to maybe being eaten, and then certain things are punished by being eaten, it probably serves this purpose of discouraging that behavior in two ways, because you have these stories. And then, it's a public display. That's one of the key aspects of ritual, is that it's very public. So it has a societal thing. There are private rituals, but really ritual in the anthropological sense, we're talking about something. A religious ritual really is something it is every ritual, if I'm remembering like the academic definition right now. It has to be public in the sense that it being public is within a societal context, within a cultural anthropological context, which requires multiple human beings working together to create a culture, a way of being. It has to be public because it has a certain meaning. It might be a marriage ceremony, that's a ritual, or it's eating someone, but it has to be public because it serves a societal purpose. And like I said, it's being eaten.
I mean, there's different types, but they all have the kind of same substrate. You have, in China, they have filial cannibalism, where you eat like the finger of your child and stuff. This is all their history. And then you have the other one, like revenge cannibalism, where you get revenge.
And that's what I was describing earlier. Yeah. And that promotes people to not do things to other people that makes them have revenge on them, because they don't want to die, and they also really don't want to get eaten.
Yeah, it's like a catacomb. Like it prevents. It's like a container for more. It's a container for violence, to stop more out of control violence, which is goes back to the Girardian framework of the sacrificial mechanism. So Girard studies. He says that basically ritual cannibalism seems to be the oldest form of ritual sacrifice we see. Do you agree with that, from your study of anthropology, or like in terms of the primordial prehistory of what we would call a collective sacrificial ritual, that it probably would look something like cannibalism, the devouring of, in some form, whether it's a revenge form or a celebratory form at a funeral or something else?
So I wouldn't make a claim like that myself, generally, just because it's hard to really know, because we have hunter-gatherers, but they hunter-gatherers that live in the modern world are maybe not the same as hunter-gatherers that lived in a world without us. So I never want to assume anything, but I would say that, that's probably the most likely thing. And there's another element to this. Like I talked about animism at the beginning, and animism and believing in energy. And often cannibalism, especially in the revenge form, but really in any form, it is tied in with the idea of objects. And generally, this is not only living objects, body parts, living people themselves, but also inanimate objects. But they have energy, and spaces have energy. And that energy through certain ritual practices can be transferred from one person to another. And it seems like in a culture that understands the universe and everything around them having energy, and that they can consume more energy and they can get energy, it seems like it's not that far of a stretch to say that you should eat somebody and take their energy. And what we do see, in fact, is that this is a practice that a lot of diverse people around the world believe. And it is the most basic way of, it seems to me to be the most basic way of sacrifice.
And you see glimmers of this mechanism like popping up in recent times. In the 1960s, they had the Indonesian massacre. Remember the massacres taking place against the suspected communists that was basically condoned by the government, right-wing government. There's a movie about it called The Act of Killing. It's a documentary where the guy, Joshua Oppenheimer, made it a few years ago. And he embedded himself amongst the living retired guys who were part of the military, little squads that were going out and killing people in the streets and rounding them up and butchering them. And he asked them to make a movie because they were still celebrated as heroes. He said, I want you guys to make a movie about your exploits. And they were such fans of Western movies like mafia movies and stuff that they styled it like sometimes they would style their movies like a spaghetti Western or a mafia movie or like a James Bond movie. And they would, and the real killers would reenact their killings onto the descendants oftentimes, and they didn't know it at the time because there was some kind of there were some things going on behind the scenes, like candidates for the actors to play the role of the people being slaughtered were sometimes the descendants of the actual guys who were slaughtered. So the killers were reenacting their gruesome killings onto the descendants, and they didn't know it fully at first until they get confronted with it in the making of the movie. So it's such a brilliant movie. It's a movie about killers making a movie in celebration of their mythic, kind of their mythic interpretation of their conquests. And then in the making of their movie, they start to become repulsed by what they did, and like their guilt starts to crack through the facade of the film, and it's like fascinating. They literally have to like purge their guilt out of their system, literally on screen. It's the most Christian, like Christ haunted documentary I've seen in decades. But because of its revelatory, like unmasking of the mechanisms of like how states structure, violence and just justify it, and might makes right, and what happens when might makes right is confronted with the voice of the victim, and how does it unravel. And literally the guy at the end, when he's confronted with his guilt, all he can do is just throw up, but he can't throw up. There's nothing to throw up. So he just dry heaves repeatedly over and over again at the end of the movie. And that's the end. It's this like, and it's all documentary. None of it staged. I mean, it's staged in the sense of the killers are staging their reenactments, but it's all real. It's brilliant. But anyways, they say at one point that when they were doing their killings in the 60s, the killer said we had to drink the blood of our victims or else we'd go insane. We'd lose our minds, which is so fascinating to me because it's like an artifact, a vestige of that more primitive ritual cannibalism that was going on. Like you said, trying to take the essence, the energy, like of the victim. And like if they didn't do it, they would lose their minds. It's so strange. Like they're describing in their own terms a similar, like a kind of phenomenon that you would. It's like you have to complete the process. You have to like take in the being of your victim in order to like. And
that's a ritual, right? I mean, drinking that blood, that is a ritual. And if they believe it, if they're being told, and they will believe it because it serves their brain. Their brain will protect itself. The soul will protect itself. That they believe that, then they're going to drink that blood, and then they're like, I drank the blood, I'm good. Like I served we did the ritual. I did it.
Yeah.
So
that's what Rene Girard says, that we didn't just stop burning witches because we discovered the scientific method. We discovered the scientific method because we stopped burning witches. And this is where he gets this idea of like the best flourishing of Western society and technology development, and in the nonviolent sense of technology, developing bifocals that a poor person could afford, and developing hospitals that everybody can go to no matter what your station is in life. The idea of technology progressing in the way it has in science as a means of discovery, as something that could benefit all of humanity, not just the elite, is something that happens as society is demythologized and demystified of its kind of superstitious ritual beliefs. Like once you stop burning witches because you're starting to say, well, yeah, I don't know. We just burnt her, and I heard I knew somebody got sick. Somebody's sick again, and so you start to break the disbelief, and you start to really question the magic of the whole process. And you start to say, well, maybe that woman didn't do this. Maybe, and that's what the gospel does, right? Because the gospel literally takes a witch burning, so to speak, of Jesus, deconstructs it, demythologizes it, takes all the cartoonish Marduk and all the Thor, sending lightning bolts, takes all of that mythological trappings that encase ancient mythology, and it deconstructs the process in which someone is sacrificed and then ends up becoming projected as a god, and it reverses it and unveils it and shows that it's just a mob. It's not a god that demanded his blood. It's a mob that's caught up in jealousy and fears and resentments and envy. That's why Jesus died. It wasn't the God's decree that he shall die, and they took him to a cliff and he flew off into the sky. And every year on that date, we have a celebration of our crops. That's what myth sounds like. The gospel sounds like a gritty news report that unveils the sausage making of myth. And it shows you, okay, this was the flowery version of it. Now we're going to see the underbelly of what happens. It's not gods killing gods. It's not gods sending gods flying off as little birds into the sky. It's actually just gritty, violent whippings, beatings, lynchings of people who are a threat to the social order, and they're scapegoated and they're blamed and they're unfairly treated. And actually, the gospel say God stands on the side of the victim of that, of the very engine of our myth making, of our culture making. God goes into that engine and basically breaks it open, because when you actually put the real God, the idea is in the Christian story, when you put the real God into the man-made God-making machine, it breaks it, because it's built on a lie. It's built on a social, like you said, a social construct, that if we all believe this person's guilty, it has its own kind of efficaciousness. But the moment you start to say, wait a second, maybe God didn't demand us to do this. Maybe it doesn't have meaning. Maybe there is no relationship between ripping the heart out of this latest victim and the sun rising, so to speak, right? Maybe this woman with a strange nose who's weird and has a raspy voice, when we burned her, maybe this isn't why we healed from the illness. And once you start to put that doubt, it loses the unanimity of belief. And once the unanimity is punctured, you start to get people thinking a little bit more for themselves. And once they start to think a little bit more for themselves, they start to say, you know what maybe caused this plague? I'm looking at one of these dead bodies and there's a weird growth on there, that kind of bacteria. Maybe that's what was going on. Can we get a piece of glass and zoom in on that a little bit? And then you start getting magnifying glasses. Then you start getting, and so technology starts to develop around the foundation of losing belief in the shared ritual of that sacrifice.
Yeah. And that's what happened to the cult in Papua New Guinea, to the cult, is that it was shattered. The glass ceiling was shattered. That the secret was revealed. And once the secret was revealed, and the way of understanding that secret societally as a group was shattered, there was no going back. You can't put it back in. It's like Pandora's box.
And that's what's happening to America.
Right.
Because I see states and cultures as synonymous with religion.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing. You break down social constructs to their most basic, right? When you break down social constructs to their most basic, what you find is that you can break down to different identities and different beliefs in who you are. So, I'm not just an American. I'm a Christian. Ethnically, I'm Irish. I'm different things, different identities, and different people value those in different ways and different percentages. And percentages, even putting a percentage to it, is allowing man to, the ideas of man to go in. The second you open your mouth, you're doing a social construct. The phonemes of what I'm speaking, they only mean something to you because of socially constructed language. And even the language that someone speaks ties into how they view the world, because different languages are constructed based on their reality of the world. And that's why language changes over time. That's why we can't say retard anymore. I'm sorry, I don't know if I can say that here, but that's that type of thing.
Well, I say that violence retards like progress. I think you can say that.
Yes.
You're allowed to use it as an action word, I think.
Yeah.
You just can't you can't situate it as a person, I guess.
Right. I think that's
because of the cross of Christ, that there's sensitivity to naming something in a way that emphasizes the difference that they have, that may come across as a barrier of weakness in relationship to the norm, right? And that's why, see, it's only Christianity that we have such sacredness around these words. I mean, it used to be when you were disabled or handicapped, if you went to the entertainment in Roman Empire days to go see a gladiatorial game, you weren't given the best seats of the house. You might be thrown in for today's entertainment. But today, and 2,000 years later, after Jesus said the first shall be last and the last shall be first, the best seats in the house or the movie theater are the disabled section, the handicapped section. And you can go into a movie as it's playing, right? And it's already started 5 minutes in, and it's crowded. Let's say it's a sold out ticket. You can't get any seats anywhere. You got a party, right? You're looking around, you got 2 or 3 people with you, and you watch, because I always like to watch this part. It's a crowded theater. It's hard to get those anymore these days. But when you see a crowded theater and you see somebody straggling in 10 minutes into the movie, and they look at that whole row of handicapped seats, and they will not sit there because of the social aura, in my opinion, the sacred status that we afford those who have disabilities, that they won't even though the statistical odds, right, that a whole fleet of handicapped people are going to come in at the last, like 20 minutes into the movie now, and they're going to be you're going to be taking one of their seats. That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But they won't sit there. Now, you could also be cynical and say, well, I don't want to be seen as if I am just, handicapped. That's there. So let's be fair.
And that's how those are enforced, right? That's how these types of ideas in society are enforced. They're enforced with societal pressure, but they're also enforced in codified laws. When I went to college, I went to a parking lot that was a mile away, but there was a codified law that said that a certain percentage in a certain location had to be handicapped.
Right.
Nobody ever parked in those handicapped locations because a handicapped person has a spot in the garage. They're not coming in, or even on the road. They're not parking a mile away, but they were there, and they were the best ones.
And what moral imagination, where did that moral imagination to create laws with that kind of impetus come from? In my opinion, it comes from Christianity.
Right.
It's not to say that obviously other societies, if you had an elderly person in your family and your grandma needed help, they would give deference to grandma, but that was your grandma. There was no concept of
and those have their own cultural underpinnings. I mean, the idea of respecting your elders is a Confucian idea, and Confucianism guides not only China, but also Japan to a lesser extent, and Korea to an extraordinary extent. They're based on Confucianism of what is the Middle Kingdom.
Yeah. What is magic? Can you explain what magic is from an anthropological standpoint? I think it's similar to what you're talking about with energy and objects or something. Can you?
Yeah. So it depends on if you're using magic with a C or magic with a CK, because I think magic with a K in anthropology, let me just pull up a definition, but this is one of the favorite ways that anthropologists introduce, like when you're in an undergrad, the concept of magic is, I think, baseball. Is that magic? So in anthropology,
Field of Dreams is magic. That's baseball. Yeah.
Oh yeah. They break it down. Okay. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? Oh, I have it here. So there's these classifications of magic come from Sir James George Fraser in a book called the Golden Bow. And I actually, so that's
which
from
informed
1890.
Gerard's work a lot, by the way.
Did it? Okay. Yeah. So these are, sometimes I literally just pull out I have my anthropology textbook
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
the one from like basic cultural anthropology, and I
Yeah.
use it more often. Like it's good. But there's sympathetic magic. This
Yeah.
category is premised on the principle of like affects like, implying
Right.
that an effect resembles its cause. And this gets broken up into contagious and homeopathic, which is imitative.
Yeah.
And the first one, contagious, this is like even after physical contact has been separated. So what this basically means is, and this would be culturally informed. It might be, blowing powder in someone's face. That's a real thing in certain places. It might be, they're usually public, right? Like they would come out and do something to you. They put something on you. They give you a mark. They say something to you in public. So it's a ritual. It's very public. And then homeopathic. An example could be creating a figure of an enemy. This is like a voodoo doll. This is the type of magic. And with this homeopathic type, if you have a voodoo doll and you're stabbing it, what can happen, or whatever, that's voodoo specifically. Voodoo being a syncretic religion, syncretic meaning two things mixed together, multiple systems mixed together that came out of somewhere in the Caribbean, mix of Yoruba traditions from West Africa and Christianity. So you don't even like, someone can have a voodoo doll or some other way of cursing you, some other ritual of cursing you, and they can do that ritual. Just make it known to someone else that they did that ritual. And then there have been studies in anthropology, and I can find you this example if you're interested. I'd have to dig a little bit, but somebody would then, through secondhand knowledge, learn of the fact that they've been cursed. And even though they didn't have direct contact with this person, they don't even know if it's true. But if they believe it's true, even, and there are cases, even when they don't even necessarily believe, at least they don't admit they believe in their traditions, they will have, there have been documented metaphysical, like physiological symptoms as a result of this. Like there is a spiritual element to health, and magic is one of the ways that you deal with it.
So you're saying person A puts a voodoo curse on person B. Person C finds out that person A put that curse on person B, but does not inform person B of that. But the fact that person C believes that he's done that starts to have an effect on person B. Is that what you're saying? Is that what you said? I know that maybe
I think I got a little screwed up with the letters, I think.
So just run back that analogy, that example you're trying to explain.
Okay. So a shaman, which is somebody who communicates with the spirit world, usually somebody that's going to be doing this. A shaman does a ritual, puts a curse on a guy named Jeff. And then Jeff, who has been cursed, the shaman then tells freaking Sally or whatever. And then Sally runs around, tells another person, and then that person tells Jeff. And Jeff now knows, he believes, he's been told he's been cursed, and now he exhibits physiological symptoms. This has been documented in multiple cases.
That's very similar to the placebo effect in the science of healing, like this idea of, like, they've shown that people who, if they're surrounded by a community that believe they're getting better, will heal a lot faster and a lot more surely than those who they don't have a support network of people who believe that the medicine or whatever they're getting is efficacious. And so oh man, he's not getting better. If you all agree he's not getting better, then it's more likely that he won't get better. So it's kind of this weird thing there that it's very hard to measure. It's hard to study that, because people, especially in the West, have totally wanted to eliminate any of that from consideration in serious circles.
Yeah, but the thing is that I think that that's the perception that a lot of people want. But if you really go in and you look, like, I mean, we know what Bohemian Grove is, right? This is a basic thing in any circles that we're running in. Bohemian Grove, like, think about what that is for a moment, because Bohemian Grove is a bunch of the most powerful people in the world, in the country, definitely in the world, really, who are having a ritual. They are having a ritual where they are showing public deference to a god, and this god is either Baal or Canaan or Baal or gosh, what's the other one's name? The Morlock, not Morlock.
Yeah,
you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Baal or the other one, Moloch.
Yeah.
Yeah. So these are old gods, and these are gods that are specifically, I think, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, like cast aside specifically. And these are people that are publicly worshiping these gods that literally sacrifice children. And even though, yes, when they went to Bohemian Grove, when Alex Jones got this, yeah, it was a effigy of a child. But there's symbolism to that as well. There's symbolism to wearing those clothes, going out there worshiping this thing. It sends a message. It affects the metaphysical underpinnings of who these people believe they are and who they think of themselves in their in-group. And this is really how a lot of like secret societies function is they produce through their ceremonies, through their rituals, and through the stories that they tell through metaphor. Humans learn through metaphor. That's why fiction is so important. Even in television, it's so important with the way that we view situations, even if we think it's real or not. And then they're going to go out in the world thinking that that's going to be in their back of their head. And that's their identity, because these are the other people that they identify with. It's their patronage network in a lot of ways. And they're going to act in ways that are in line with the type of person who was in a ceremony where they sacrificed an effigy of a child. Is it still symbolic?
Yeah. And that goes for so much. Media has a lot of magic properties, if you think of it that way, because, you know, you can create a contagion of fear, contagion of nihilism, contagion of all kinds of horrible, negative, antisocial behaviors and characteristics. You can convince millions of people that their bodies are completely helpless without big pharma's inputs, you know, to fight off any disease, chronic or acute. You can convince them that, you know, just and even, you know, that's what I don't like reactionary media, because so much of reactionary media is all about complaining about how bad things are. And when you're constantly telling people every day, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, this is horrible, this is horrible, this is horrible. Oh my goodness, it's fear, 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 anger, 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 anger. You feel, I mean, when you put that into your mind every day, that shapes your world. You know, if you don't believe you can do anything because there's this giant tyrannical conspiracy that's got everything on lock, and any moment of goodness is all just a psyop. When you start to succumb to that kind of paranoia and this and just kind of defeatism, that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know? So it cuts both ways, both the establishment court jester media and the dialectic, you know, anti-establishment media. That if you often too much of all of that is sapping your life energy and your vitality away, you know. And that's why I think it's important, just to bring it back home to what we're doing here, is I think it's important to have an education in anthropology, and really take that seriously, because I was telling you before the show that so much of our culture is a therapeutic psychology based society, you know, like self-help stuff. But I think we need to get back to anthropology, the good anthropology, not the, you know, corrupted political court jester anthropology, but anthropology that is in the pursuit of the truth, because I think that's a discipline that will help us be able to see through power games and manipulations and rituals. You'll be able to see the liturgical structure of the things we do in society, which is much more important than getting lost in your internal mind. It's okay to go there if you want to do that, but I think therapy culture is very overrated, and I think it gets you in a disembodied state of find your own bliss, which is, you know, the complaint against boomers is the find your own bliss mantra, which is therapeutic culture, therapy culture. You know, that's where they were the generation that was first really inculcated in mass practice therapy culture, right? Post World War II is where America's government says we're going to full court press to push, you know, psychoanalytical based therapy culture across the heartland and reshape the minds of a good old American, you know, working class families, because this religion stuff's too dangerous. We don't want it. We want something more state friendly. And look what we got. Look what we have now, you know?
Yeah. And I don't want to get into it too much, but there is another conversation to be had, even just about Protestantism as coming out of the same time as absolutism. And those things are related. There's multiple times in world history where it happened in China, it happened in Egypt, and they weren't all that successful. They tried to bring in monotheism to these places because monotheism is absolutely 100% tied in with like an authoritarian ruler, and more so than monotheism, but but there's a spectrum of monotheism as well, because when you take Protestantism out of Catholicism, like Protestantism, that when you take the liturgical elements out of it, and you look at something like evangelical Protestantism, there are other elements in Orthodox and Catholic traditions that have, while it is monotheism, there are other elements in it that are rooted in a lot of these ancient polytheistic traditions. So it has a lot of these polytheistic, at least, underpinnings to it in Orthodox and Catholic and Coptic Christianity. But these other traditions, especially evangelical ones that talk about convening directly with God, they're stripped of these, of even the remnants of the polytheistic human underpinnings of society, of these past traditions. And you then are in more of a monotheistic position, which is even more towards absolutism. And this is what England did successfully, as well as other Protestant countries. And I think it has a lot to do with the differences between certain cultures today, and also the United States, which I know the two of us are not Protestants, but we are from what I would think is an accurate to describe a Protestant nation, because that was the underpinnings of the original government, and everything else since then is kind of sat on top of it. And that's, I don't know if you've read the book American Nations, that breaks up the United States, Canada, and Mexico into different areas. But he makes a very good argument that I tend to believe is that these different nations, like you look at New England, which in Yankeedom splits into Ohio a little bit, the original settlers of the areas, the original people, like the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and even like New Amsterdam, they created a culture in that area that, yes, new people coming in did affect the area, but not as much as you might think. It effectively, those new people affected the old structure, kept itself pretty much intact, and it did have big effects from others. But even today, you can see elements of New Amsterdam within New York. He makes an argument for it. I can't get into it right now, but American Nations by Colin Woodard.
Very interesting. Well, I think you've really outlined some interesting insights from your study of anthropology today, and I really appreciate your time. Any last thoughts or kind of anything you want to leave us with? And also tell us a little bit about the best way to follow your work, please.
Yeah. So, God, I don't have any closing thoughts. We covered anything. Yeah. It's been 2 hours. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. That's what I always say. It's the first line from the Tao by Lao Tzu Ching. It's a Chinese holy book. And I apply that to social constructs in the way that they are. And whenever we're talking about something, we're already moving out from the realm of God and into the realm of human beings, even when we speak. So, Illegitimate Scholar, YouTube podcast. I'm starting to do standalone YouTube videos. So, Illegitimate Scholar on all podcasting apps, Spotify, Apple, and all the rest, on YouTube. And I've been writing a lot on Twitter, ill_scholar under Samuel Urban. And I'll send you the links if you wouldn't mind throwing them in.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate your time, Samuel. And it's look forward to seeing more content from you and maybe doing some more dialogues in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great introduction to your work. It's good stuff. So we'll keep abreast of what you're doing. And for those of you who want to stay in touch with us at aneighborschoice.com, email us hello@aneighborschoice.com. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.